The huge log still smelled of fresh pine sap when Thomas Bridger realized his mistake. It was October 1827, and the 34-year-old trapper had just finished constructing what he believed was a proper smokehouse at his winter camp in the Wind River Range of present-day Wyoming. He'd built it 8 feet square with a peaked roof, the kind he'd seen growing up in Kentucky before heading west 5 years earlier. The structure looked solid. The gaps between the logs were chinked with moss and clay. The door fit snug. But when he hung his first batch of elk quarters and lit the fire, things didn't go as planned. Instead of curling around the meat, the smoke shot straight up and escaped through gaps he hadn't noticed. Within 3 hours, the inside temperature climbed so high that fat was dripping from the elk, pooling on the earthen floor. He wasn't preserving the meat, he was cooking it. And out here, 200 miles from the nearest trading post, spoiled meat wasn't just a waste, it was a threat to survival. What Thomas didn't know that October afternoon was that he was about to learn a technique that would change everything he thought he understood about preserving meat. The knowledge wouldn't come from another trapper or any book. It would come from a Shoshone elder who had been watching his efforts from across the valley with quiet amusement. The method he would show Thomas, a different way to build and operate a smokehouse, would go against everything Thomas thought he knew, but it would work. It would keep meat good not just through one winter, but 2 complete seasons. This is the story of how one mistake led to a discovery that mountain men would quietly share for the next 2 decades. A technique so effective, meat preserved this way could survive 1,000-mile journeys, feed entire brigades through brutal winters, and turn a struggling free trapper into one of the most reliable suppliers in the Rocky Mountain fur trade. And like most stories worth telling, it doesn't begin with success. It begins with failure. Thomas Bridger had come west in 1822, part of William Ashley's second expedition up the Missouri River. He was 29, strong from farm work, and completely unprepared for what mountain life demanded. The first 2 winters taught him lessons no book ever could. He'd partnered with seasoned trappers, shared their camps, listened and learned. By 1826, he'd saved enough in beaver pelts to strike out on his own. Becoming a free trapper meant more profit, but every risk landed squarely on his shoulders. No partner to help when the rivers froze. No backup when trouble appeared. No one to show him the quiet, crucial skills that kept you alive out here. One of those skills was meat preservation. Thomas thought he had it down. He'd watched men smoke meat plenty of times. How hard could it be? In 1827, the Wind River Range was prime territory. Remote enough that beaver were still plentiful, but accessible enough that a lone trapper could work a stream without constantly looking over his shoulder. He'd chosen his winter camp carefully. A sheltered valley with good water, thick timber, and southern exposure to catch every bit of winter sun. He built a solid 14-foot square log cabin with a stone fireplace and laid in a good supply of firewood. He'd even found a small herd of elk that wintered nearby. The smokehouse seemed like the last piece of his winter prep. He felled 8 straight pines, stripped the branches, notched them into a tight square. The structure stood 8 feet tall, walls 6 feet high, with a peaked roof, adding another 2 feet. The floor was packed earth. He figured any dripping fat would soak into the ground. He cut ventilation slots, 4 inches wide, near the top of each wall. The door was 3 feet wide, made of split pine planks lashed with leather hinges. Inside, he installed a series of horizontal poles at various heights to hang meat. For the fire pit, he dug a shallow depression in the center of the floor, about 2 feet across and 6 inches deep, lining it with flat creek stones. His plan was simple. Light a small fire using green wood to produce plenty of smoke, hang the meat on the poles, and let the smoke do the work. That's how he'd seen it done back in Kentucky. But this wasn't Kentucky. Kentucky wasn't 7,000 feet above sea level. Kentucky didn't swing from sunny afternoons to freezing nights in October. Kentucky smokehouses weren't built from fresh-cut pine logs, still oozing sap. And Kentucky farmers had refined their techniques over generations, perfecting small details that mattered more than he realized. When Thomas lit his first fire that October afternoon, he used pine, because that's what he had, and that's what the smokehouse was made from. He hung 4 elk quarters inside, each about 40 pounds, suspended from the poles with rawhide cords threaded through cuts in the meat. He closed the door, stepped back, and waited. Within an hour, he could tell something was wrong. The fire he meant to keep small and smoky kept trying to flare up. The pine, full of resin, burned too hot. He tried to damp it down, but the smoke didn't linger. It escaped through the gaps. The interior heated fast. Instead of curing, the elk began to roast. Fat sizzled and dripped. The scent was wrong. All wrong. And just like that, a major part of his winter supplies was slipping away. A mistake like that in the high country wasn't just frustrating. It was dangerous. But mistakes out here were sometimes the only way you learned something worth keeping for life. Pine burned hot and fast, even when green. The resin in the wood gave off a thick, acrid smoke that stung the nose and smelled all wrong. Thomas added more green branches to cool the fire, but that only thickened the smoke. It poured from every seam in the smokehouse, through the vent slots, around the door frame, even between logs he thought he'd sealed. By the 3rd hour, Thomas opened the door to check the meat, and his heart dropped. The elk was cooking. The outer surface had turned dark brown, nearly black in some spots. Fat dripped steadily onto the stones below, hissing on contact and adding a bitter, burned smell to the already acrid pine smoke. He reached up and touched one of the quarters. The outside was hot. He cut into it with his knife. The meat near the surface had gone gray. Cooked, not cured, not preserved. He pulled the quarters out and hung them from a pole outside to cool. Then he sat in the dirt beside his smoking failure, trying to figure out where he'd gone wrong. The math didn't look good. That elk had come down 3 days ago. He had about 160 pounds of meat hanging in the air. Even in October, even at this elevation, it would start to spoil soon without proper preservation. He could try to eat it all, but that was impossible. He could cut it into strips and dry it into jerky, but that would take days of cold, miserable work. And he'd already lost half a day trying this failed smokehouse. The next morning, Thomas stepped out of his cabin and froze. Frost coated the ground, and a Shoshone man sat cross-legged about 50 yards away. Old, maybe 60, maybe older. Wrapped in a buffalo robe. No weapons visible. Just sitting, watching. Thomas had encountered Shoshone before. Their people were generally friendly to white trappers, unlike the Blackfeet further north. Still, finding a man waiting outside your camp before dawn was enough to put a hand on your rifle. He stepped forward slowly, rifle in hand but pointed down. He gave a nod. The old man nodded back. No one spoke. Then the man pointed at the smokehouse and said something in Shoshone. Thomas didn't know the words, but he understood the meaning. The old man had seen everything. Probably watched Thomas build it. Watched the smoke pour out. Watched the meat fail. What happened next would change everything Thomas knew about smoking meat. The old man stood and walked toward the smokehouse. He didn't ask permission. Just opened the door, looked inside, ran a hand along the inside walls. He examined the fire pit, looked up at the ventilation, then he shook his head. He began to speak, gesturing as he did, drawing shapes in the dirt, walking off steps, demonstrating in the simplest way possible. Thomas followed, watched, listened. The first thing the old man pointed out was the fire pit. He gestured at the shallow hole Thomas had dug in the center of the floor and shook his head firmly. Then he stepped off 15 paces away from the smokehouse, stopped, and pointed at the ground. He made a digging motion, then drew a line in the dirt back toward the smokehouse wall. Thomas blinked. The message was clear. The fire didn't belong inside the smokehouse. It belonged out here. That didn't make sense, not at first. Every smokehouse Thomas had ever seen, every one he remembered from Kentucky, had the fire inside. How else could the meat soak in the smoke? But the old man insisted. He paced off the steps again and began sketching a new design. The fire pit, he showed, should be dug outside, 3 feet deep and 2 feet across. From there, a trench should be dug toward the smokehouse, 10 inches wide, a foot deep, lined with flat stones. At the base of the smokehouse wall, a hole should be cut where the trench connected so smoke could enter. On the opposite wall, another low hole for fresh air. The smoke would flow from the outside fire through the trench into the smokehouse, then out through the top vent slots. The smoke would be cooled by its journey, traveling underground for 15 feet. Hot when it left the fire, but barely warm by the time it touched the meat. With this setup, you could keep a strong fire burning and still surround the meat with cool smoke. Days of it. No heat, no cooking, just smoke doing its work, slow and steady. Thomas was skeptical, but the old man was patient. He demonstrated again, this time marking the angles, pointing to the sun, showing the rise of the trench, the flow of the smoke. The old man showed Thomas how to properly prepare meat for smoking. Thomas had simply quartered the elk and hung the chunks whole. The elder shook his head and pulled out a knife. With swift, practiced hands, he demonstrated how the meat should be cut, not in quarters but in strips, each about 3 inches thick and roughly a foot long. Then came another new step. The meat strips weren't smoked right away. They needed to be partially dried first, hung outside for a day or two until the surface grew tacky. That tackiness had a name, pele, and it was key. Moist meat doesn't take smoke well. The wet surface blocks smoke from sinking in, but once that pele forms, it acts like a sponge, drawing in smoke particles and holding them there. Then came the salting lesson, and that's when Thomas realized just how far off course he'd been. The old man didn't have salt with him, but made it clear through gesture and repetition. Salt was not optional. It wasn't added after, it had to come first. Thomas had thought smoking was a substitute for salting. The elder showed him it was a partner. Salt pulled moisture from the meat, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. The smoke added its own set of preserving compounds, phenols, acids, natural antimicrobials. Together, salt and smoke could preserve meat for not just weeks, but months, years even, with proper storage. On the 4th day, after that failed attempt, Thomas was ready. He had rebuilt the smokehouse system according to the elder's design. He'd gathered bundles of aged cottonwood, carefully selected from dead but solid branches. He had taken another elk, prepared the meat in strips, and hung them for 2 days in the cool, open air until each one had that telltale pele. He'd traded a steel knife to a nearby Shoshone camp, 5 miles distant, for 3 pounds of salt they'd collected from a natural salt spring. Every piece of meat was rubbed with that salt, thoroughly and completely. This time, when Thomas lit the fire, it was different from the start. He built it slowly, using the cottonwood. Let it burn down to a bed of hot coals. Then he added more green wood to create thick smoke. The smoke rolled into the trench, cooled during its journey, and entered the smokehouse low to the ground. Inside, the temperature never rose much above the outside air, but the smoke curled around the hanging meat, rich and steady, rising toward the vents above. He checked the strips every few hours. The color darkened, red to brown to deep mahogany. The meat remained firm. It smelled clean, pure, smoky in the right way. For 3 days, he kept the fire going. He added more cottonwood every few hours, keeping the flow constant. At night, he let the fire settle into coals, which still gave off enough smoke to maintain the process. By the end of the 3rd day, the meat was transformed. Hardened outside, still pliable within, dark, rich, and fragrant. The smell alone made Thomas's stomach clench with hunger. He pulled one strip down and cut it open. The knife met resistance. Inside, the meat was dry but tender, safe, preserved. He took a bite, salty, smoky, deep. No bitterness, just pure, preserved meat. He hung the finished product inside his cabin, away from damp and animals. Over the next week, he smoked another elk, then a deer. By the time snow dusted the ridges, he had over 200 pounds of preserved meat hanging in his rafters. He even started experimenting, adding sagebrush in small amounts to the cottonwood fire. It changed the flavor, earthier, sharper. He liked it. He took notes in his journal, rough sketches of the trench, lists of preferred woods, small observations about how long each batch took based on outside temperature and wind direction. It became a ritual, a rhythm. Each time he gathered wood, he tested it by snapping it clean and sniffing the break. If it smelled green or musty, he tossed it. If it cracked dry and clean, he kept it. He began carving small notches in a log to keep track of how many batches he'd smoked. By winter's deepest cold, there were 6, and for the first time since he'd come west, Thomas Bridger felt not just ready for winter, but ready for whatever came after. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was mastering something, not with words or books, but with earth, fire, smoke, and meat. The old way, the right way, the kind of knowledge earned in silence and paid for in failure. He tested varying the salt amounts and discovered that heavier salting extended preservation even longer but made the meat less palatable unless soaked in water before eating. The winter of 1827-1828 proved the method's value. Thomas's smoked meat lasted not just through that winter, but well into the following summer. When he traveled to the 1828 rendezvous at Bear Lake in July, he still had meat from the previous October that was perfectly edible. Other trappers took notice. When Thomas shared some of his preserved meat around the fire, men who'd been in the mountains for years leaned in close, asking how he'd kept meat so long. Thomas shared the core of the technique. He described the external fire pit and the underground tunnel. He explained the use of hardwoods over pine. He mentioned the importance of salting the meat before smoking. But he kept some lessons to himself. The subtleties passed to him by the Shoshone elder. The precise thickness of the meat strips, the need for the pele, the exact pitch of the smoke tunnel, those he kept close. Some knowledge had to be earned. Still, word spread. By the 1829 rendezvous, multiple trappers had built smokehouses using external fire pits. By 1830, it was becoming a standard method among free trappers who ran permanent winter camps. Jim Bridger, Thomas's distant cousin and a veteran of the mountains since 1822, reportedly told others it was the single most valuable technique he'd learned in 8 years of trapping. The impact went beyond survival. Properly preserved meat became a commodity. Trappers who mastered the method could trade smoked meat for gear, horses, ammunition. At rendezvous, a few pounds of well-preserved meat could fetch more than most beaver pelts. Thomas began to specialize. He chose his winter camps based not on trapping beaver, but on access to good game and solid ground for tunneling. He became known not just as a trapper, but as a meat supplier. The method reshaped how men moved across the land. Before, a lone trapper had to stay close to huntable ground. He couldn't risk running out of food. But with preserved meat, he could kill 3 elk in October and trap beaver 100 miles away by November. His camp became mobile. His options widened. The design's genius was its simplicity. The tunnel could range from 10 to 25 feet, adjusted for terrain and materials. The fire pit could be scaled up or down. A one-man camp needed just a 4-foot square structure. A post serving a dozen men might build a smokehouse 10 feet on a side, with multiple tunnels feeding its smoke. Winter revealed more advantages. In frigid temperatures, the external fire could burn continuously without overheating the meat. The tunnel cooled the smoke so well that even a roaring fire sent smoke into the chamber just above freezing. This meant the coldest months, when meat spoiled slowest, became the most efficient time to process it. And unlike other methods, the tunnel smokehouse proved forgiving. Jerky required dry air and mild weather. Salt curing needed precise temperature control. The smokehouse didn't care. Thomas processed meat in October sun, November snow, and January deep freeze. If he could light a fire and keep the tunnel clear, the meat would cure. But the method wasn't foolproof. Each fall, Thomas inspected the tunnel. Moisture and time would erode the mortar between stones. Gaps formed. Smoke leaked. The air draft faltered. Repairs became routine. He learned about soil, too. Sandy soil didn't hold heat. Clay cracked, a blend of both, packed tight and laid 6 inches deep over the tunnel logs, offered the best insulation. He learned by trial, by fire, by meat ruined or saved. Wood selection also mattered more than he'd guessed. Cottonwood, willow, and aspen all produced clean smoke, but not the same kind. Cottonwood burned steady and gave thick smoke. Willow burned hot and fast. Aspen burned cool and light. By mixing wood types, Thomas controlled how hard or soft the smoke hit the meat. For heavier curing, he used mostly cottonwood. For lighter flavor, he leaned on aspen. He'd sometimes start a fire with willow to get heat, then switch to cottonwood once the coals were right. Salt remained the bottleneck. In 1828, it sold for $1 a pound, when a good beaver pelt fetched 3 to 5. Thomas budgeted carefully. He traded knives and gear for salt. He rationed it. He soaked oversalted meat in creek water before eating. And with each season, he refined his process. He carved marks on logs, records of batches, weather, wood type. He left nothing to chance. By 1831, he was smoking hundreds of pounds each season. Other trappers stopped by his camp not just to trade, but to learn. And even then, Thomas didn't tell them everything. He'd nod, he'd smile. But some things, some knowledge, you didn't give away. You passed it, slowly, carefully, one winter at a time. Years later, long after the last rendezvous had been held, and the fur trade began to fade, some of those old trappers still swore by that technique. They'd show their sons and grandsons how to dig the tunnel, how to choose the wood, how to hang the meat just right. And if anyone asked where they'd learned it, they'd just smile and say, "Old mountain trick, been around a while." Some trappers had the knowledge and patience to collect salt themselves, gathering it from natural springs scattered through the mountains. But this required knowing where to look, and it was no small task. In the summer of 1829, Thomas spent weeks hauling brine water from a spring 40 miles from his camp. He boiled it down in iron kettles over open fires, slowly reducing the liquid until he'd stockpiled about 60 pounds of usable salt. That carefully stored cache lasted him 2 full years. Others tried skipping the salt entirely, relying on smoke alone. For a short time, it worked. Maybe a few weeks, at best 2 months. But by the heart of winter, the meat would spoil. Thomas learned quickly, salt was essential for long-term storage. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was survival. Through trial and error, he settled on a ratio. 1 ounce of salt per pound of meat struck the right balance. More salt meant longer shelf life, but made the meat almost too salty to eat unless soaked. Less salt risked spoilage. Either way, he learned the margin for error was slim. He also found that not all meat cured the same. Lean animals like deer and elk required less time, 3 to 4 days of steady smoking. Fat-rich bear meat needed 5 to 6 days, and even then turned faster. The fat was prone to turning rancid, and that ruined everything. Buffalo meat, when he could get it, struck the perfect balance, lean enough to dry thoroughly, rich enough to hold flavor. The winter of 1828-1829 delivered a hard lesson. A brutal snowstorm in late December buried his valley in drifts and sealed him inside his cabin for 11 straight days. No hunting, no checking traps, barely enough room to collect firewood. What saved him wasn't luck or skill. It was the 100 pounds of smoked meat hanging above his head. It fed him every day. Without it, he likely would have starved. By 1830, word of his method was spreading. Not just among trappers, but among company men. The American Fur Company, dominant in the Rockies, took notice. They sent a man west, Harrison, a clerk from St. Louis, to see the smokehouse for himself. Thomas showed him everything. The fire pit, dug low and wide, the smoke tunnel, angled with care, the stonework, the ventilation. Harrison took notes, drew sketches, asked questions. The information was bound for company headquarters, where they planned to replicate the system at their trading posts. In return, the company made Thomas an offer. Become a supplier. Provide all the smoked meat he could produce at a guaranteed price far above what he'd earned at Rendezvous. It was a steady income, right when beaver populations were dwindling and prices were falling. He took the deal. The 1830 rendezvous at the meeting of the Popo Agie and Wind Rivers became a milestone. For the first time, smoked meat stood beside pelts, powder, and whiskey on the trade tables. Thomas and others brought in hundreds of pounds. The response was immediate. Trappers bought it to avoid hunting. Brigades loaded up before heading into remote basins. Company men purchased for outposts. It became a valued currency. This changed the mountain economy. A trapper no longer had to hunt every few days. With preserved meat, he could trap longer and farther. He could work regions thin on game, but rich in beaver. Operations grew more efficient and more profitable, and the design kept spreading. French-Canadian voyageurs with the Hudson's Bay Company learned the smoke tunnel technique and brought it north. British traders in Oregon copied the design. By the mid-1830s, smokehouses with external fire pits and underground tunnels stood from the Missouri River to the Cascades. But imitation wasn't always success. Some men misunderstood the critical slope of the tunnel. A downward pitch meant condensation collected at the low point, blocking smoke and airflow. The tunnel had to rise, slow and steady, to let moisture drain back toward the fire. Others rushed the process. They used hot fires to speed things up. But high heat defeated the purpose. It cooked the meat. Cooking wasn't preserving. Thomas kept learning. He added herbs to the fire, sagebrush, wild mint, juniper. The flavors were subtle but good. He tested storage, too. Meat lasted longest when hung in cool, dry air with good circulation. He tried sealing it in hide or storing it in barrels. That only caused mold. Hanging freely in ventilated caches was best. He also found that certain high mountain caves stayed cool and dry year-round. In the right spots, he could store smoked meat for over 2 years. He experimented with airflow as well. By placing baffles near the base of the smokehouse and adjusting the height of meat racks, he could control how evenly smoke moved through the chamber. Thicker cuts needed more smoke contact. He even tested wrapping meat in thin bark to reduce surface drying while still allowing smoke in. By the early 1830s, his reputation was set. Other trappers came not just to trade, but to watch, to ask, to learn. Some stayed through fall to help him process meat, hoping to pick up what he knew. He taught what he could, but not everything. Some things still had to be earned. And when winter came again and the wind began to howl across the high ridges, there was meat hanging in the rafters. Clean, dry, smoke-darkened. Enough to see him through until the thaw. The two-winter preservation that gave this story its name came about almost by accident. In the fall of 1831, Thomas processed an unusually large quantity of meat, nearly 300 pounds, intending to trade most of it at the 1832 rendezvous. But that year, attendance was low. Blackfoot hostilities had increased and many trappers stayed away for safety. Thomas sold what he could, but most of the meat returned with him to his winter camp. Rather than try to eat it all or watch it go to waste, he simply left it hanging in his cabin. It stayed there through the summer of 1832, then another winter, from 1832 to 1833 and into the following spring. When he finally consumed the last of it, in April 1833, that meat had lasted 18 months, spanning 2 full winters. It was darker, saltier, and drier than fresh smoked meat, but it was still edible and showed no signs of rot. Word spread. The feat added to the growing reputation of the smoke tunnel method. The success of the technique had ripple effects. Trappers who could reliably preserve meat were seen as more than just hunters. They were craftsmen. Their knowledge held weight. At future rendezvous, younger trappers would gather around these seasoned preservers, asking questions. Thomas often found himself in the center of those circles, explaining how it worked, just as he'd learned in 1827. He always credited the old Shoshone man who had helped him. Stands in winter, who had appeared during Thomas's moment of failure, shared what he knew, and then vanished. Thomas never saw him again after that first week in October, but he thought of him often. Sometimes he wondered if the old man had been watching his mistakes with quiet amusement, or if he'd simply recognized a man in need. By the mid-1830s, the fur trade was shifting. Beaver numbers were dropping after years of pressure, and the fashion for beaver felt hats was waning in favor of silk. The rendezvous system that had defined the mountain economy was unraveling. It would end entirely by 1840. But the preservation method Thomas had learned endured. As settlers moved west, they adopted the technique. Wagon trains carried it to their forts and homes. Trading posts along the Oregon and California trails built smokehouses using the same principles. The smoke tunnel, once an isolated wilderness innovation, became part of frontier life. In 1838, Thomas left the mountains. Like many others, he saw that beaver trapping was no longer sustainable. He settled near Fort Laramie, what would later become Wyoming, and opened a small trading post, catering to westbound travelers. He built a smokehouse on his land, complete with a 20-foot tunnel and an external fire pit. It became a known stop along the road west. Travelers came to buy preserved meat for their journey. Some stayed long enough for Thomas to show them how the system worked so they could build their own. When you looked at the numbers, the impact was clear. In 13 years as a mountain man from 1822 to 1838, Thomas processed thousands of pounds of meat. What stands in winter had taught him turned perishable game into dependable provisions. The time saved, the food secured, the hunts avoided, it all added up. Less waste, less risk, more time for trapping, traveling, or surviving. In the wilderness, preservation wasn't just useful, it was essential. A lone trapper 100 miles from resupply couldn't afford to lose the meat. Jerky could fail. Salt curing was finicky. But the smoke tunnel worked in sun, snow, and storm. Once built, it needed little maintenance. It handled large loads. And it produced shelf-stable meat, true preservation, not a temporary reprieve. The system's design was so effective that echoes of it could be found across the country well into the 20th century. Farm smokehouses in rural America used similar layouts, often substituting metal piping for stone-lined tunnels. But the core idea, the separation of heat and smoke, remained intact. What Thomas learned in that mountain valley wasn't just how to preserve meat. It was a broader lesson in humility and learning. That real knowledge doesn't always come from books. That skill can be passed without words. That wisdom can cross cultures. He'd left Kentucky thinking he knew how to live in the wild. It took an old Shoshone elder to show him otherwise. In the years that followed, the technique evolved. Trappers tweaked it. Settlers adapted it. Some added features. Others simplified it. Each change built on the foundation laid in 1827. By 1840, when the last rendezvous was held and the mountain man era faded, the smoking tunnel was no longer new. It was normal, commonplace. Soldiers, settlers, missionaries, all used it. What had once been novel had become necessary. What had once been taught in desperation became tradition. And the tradition didn't stop with men like Thomas. It carried forward into ranches, into homesteads, into towns, into recipes passed from mother to daughter, father to son, into frontier cookbooks, into the memory of the land. Thomas Bridger died in 1869 at the age of 76 in his home near Fort Laramie. He was no longer a trapper, but in homes, camps, and posts across the West, his quiet legacy endured. Every time a fire was lit in an external pit, every time smoke crept through a buried stone tunnel to a chamber full of meat, his story lived on. He hadn't meant to invent anything. He'd only meant to survive. But that's how the best ideas start. He'd outlived the fur trade era. He'd watched wagon trains roll west past his door. He'd seen the railroad stretch its iron spine across the plains of Wyoming. But in his later years, when visitors asked about his time in the mountains, Thomas Bridger would often return to one story. Not the one about the grizzly that nearly tore his arm off. Not the one about barely escaping a hostile war party. Not even the story of crossing a frozen river with a broken leg. No. The story he told most was from October 1827. The one where an old Shoshone elder taught him how to smoke meat properly. It wasn't the flashiest tale he had, but it was the one he credited with saving his life, more than once. It was the beginning of everything that followed. That first winter, when properly smoked elk hung in his cabin, it meant more than just food. It meant knowledge, practical, transferable, life-saving knowledge. It meant survival earned through humility, observation, and a willingness to learn from someone very different than himself. Every strip of meat that came from that smokehouse carried with it generations of wisdom. Techniques passed from elder to hunter, then adapted by one American trapper who knew enough to listen. The fire, the tunnel, the salt, the air, it all came together not in theory but in practice. That meat kept him alive through storms, fed him when the creeks froze, carried him when game vanished. And when fur prices fell, it became his trade, his livelihood. He sold it at rendezvous. He bartered it at posts. He taught others how to make it themselves. The method spread because it worked. And in the frontier world, that was all that mattered. The technique, what we now call the smoke tunnel method, quietly changed how people lived. Without it, the fur trade would have been far more dangerous, far less viable. With it, a lone trapper could range deeper into the mountains, confident he'd eat through winter. The story begins with failure. Thomas standing outside his smokehouse, watching elk quarters roast instead of cure, realizing his winter food was being ruined. It ends with success. Racks of meat perfectly preserved. A technique passed among mountain men, a method that outlived the era that birthed it. And in the middle lies a quiet moment. An old man kneeling in the dirt, drawing a smoke tunnel with his finger. A gesture of help. A choice to teach. The gap between Thomas's Kentucky upbringing and the harsh mountain reality wasn't crossed by grit alone. It was bridged by knowledge, patience. A conversation that didn't need many words. The smoke tunnel wasn't new, it wasn't even his. It came from generations of adaptation, refined by experience, shaped by necessity. What Thomas did was recognize its worth. He learned it, he practiced it, and crucially, he shared it. He helped turn it from hidden skill into common practice. The meat that hung in his cabin during the winter of 1827-1828 wasn't just food. It was the line between survival and starvation. And that line was defined by the small things. The slope of a tunnel, the dryness of wood, the way salt drew moisture, the angle of a cut of meat. These things seem small until it's February. The snow is 6 feet deep, and you're 200 miles from help. Then those details mean everything. Thomas Bridger's story, like so many of his generation, is a story of adaptation. He came west full of book learning and farm knowledge, and it nearly got him killed. He stayed alive because he was willing to learn, to admit he didn't know, to let someone teach him, and then he passed that knowledge forward. That smokehouse, standing outside his cabin, became more than a building. It became a symbol. Built wrong once, then rebuilt right. First a monument to failure, then a beacon of success. A place where learning happened, not through lectures, but through mistakes. The real lesson Thomas Bridger left behind wasn't just how to smoke meat. It was this: survival doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from being willing to learn anything, from anyone, at any time. That's the real story of how one man's smoked meat lasted through 2 winters. It's not really about the meat at all. It's about what it took to learn how to make it last,